The thing I like about Bitcoin is that what we saw happen with the truckers, right? So the truckers protested the establishment. They turned out they were right. They weren't protesting medicine. They were protesting authoritarianism. And if you protest authoritarianism then drops the hammer on you, and they shut down their bank accounts. And when they shut down your bank account, now you can't pay your mortgage. You can't pay your electric bill. You can't buy gas for your car. You can't travel. You can't do anything, right? But now Bitcoin kind of solves that problem, but right, because they can't do that. The government can't shut down your Bitcoin.
Right. I wrote a piece for Huffington Post back in 2014 called "Bitcoin Should Be Embraced by All Activists."
So, and Bobby Kennedy made that point. You know how
exactly. So, freedom of speech and freedom of having uncensorable money are pari passu the same thing. You know, we when we do a transaction, you and I peer to peer. It should be uncensored. There shouldn't be an intermediary telling us what to do with that transaction, just like there should not be an intermediary telling us what to say to each other. And so Bitcoin is to money what the First Amendment is to free speech. And it's without it, you can't even have free speech, because if all the channels of speech are controlled by centralized corporations with an agenda, then you don't have freedom of money or free speech. If you fix the money and adopt Bitcoin, which is uncensorable and unconfiscatable, then free speech and civil rights and everything else comes on top of that. But fix the money first, and then you can build a society that reflects economic freedom, freedom of speech, freedom to worship, etc. It's freedom comes from freedom of transaction, freedom of money. And only Bitcoin offers that because it separates state from money. I mean, the history of money essentially is, within the last few hundred years, is that it is something created by the state, right? The state typically has a monopoly on creating money, and they therefore have the ability to use that printing press to achieve an economic agenda, which may or may not be in tune with the democratic wishes of the population. I think in America, when you see outcry about money being sent to Ukraine, for example, well, the government prints the money. I mean, and no one's going to stop them. They can print it and ship it to Ukraine. Now, what we're seeing now is that, of course, all that money ends up causing inflation, and then the inflation is bankrupting the middle class, and people are outraged, and they say, stop sending money to Ukraine. But to get more to the point, they should be protesting about getting rid of fiat money and adopting Bitcoin, as we do in El Salvador, and you too can enjoy the Salvadoran miracle.
So my question is, now, if I was a trucker and they shut off my bank account, let's say I was protesting the government, which people are doing right now in the United States, from coast to coast. They're protesting the funding of a war in Gaza. And so theoretically, the government could turn off their bank accounts and stop their money. But if they had Bitcoin, how would they spend that Bitcoin? Like, I can't go to the gas station and use Bitcoin, but you can do that in El Salvador?
Yes. Yes, you can.
What?
It's a circular Bitcoin economy. It's all in Bitcoin. I mean, you can just use Bitcoin your entire life in El Salvador if you want. The adoption rate is increasing every month, every year, and but if you can do it now. So in Bitcoin Beach, you know, my friend Mike Peterson of Bitcoin Beach, he started the Bitcoin revolution in El Zonte, El Salvador, and the circular economy in El Zonte by giving all the pupusa sellers and everybody in town some free Bitcoin. And they said, just transact in Bitcoin, because the surfers that were arriving in El Zonte, they had different currencies from different countries, and there was no way for the local business people to accept that foreign money, and they don't take credit cards, and they're unbanked. So these guys would have to go 20 miles down the road to an ATM and try to get cash, and it was very cumbersome. But on a Bitcoin standard, it doesn't matter where you come from, or any country, any currency. If you have a Bitcoin, you can transact, because the local commercial people take Bitcoin, and it's an instantaneous transaction, and there's nobody who's going to stop them. You cannot interrupt or censor that transaction.
But here in the United States, that wouldn't really help me, right? Because nobody takes Bitcoin here.
Well, I mean, the adoption, why? You see what I'm saying? Like, the center of freedom has moved from the U.S. to El Salvador. So this is what I'm telling people: leave the U.S. because it's sucking hind tit. The U.S. is now at the back of the queue. They're no longer shining city on the hill. It's a fucking zoned out, fentanyl addicted, homeless person, on the parking lot dying from, whatever. That's like the U.S. is now the place to leave. It's a shithole. It's the banana republic. When the President Bukele gave his recent speech to CPAC, he was talking about inflation in the U.S. and how America is now monetizing their own debt. America prints money to buy its own debt because nobody else in the world wants to buy American debt. It's called debt monetization. And back 50 years ago, people in the U.S. would look at Central America and say, ha ha, you have to buy your own debt. You're a banana republic. And so here you have the president of El Salvador lecturing people in Washington at CPAC about the fact that you guys are now monetizing your own debt. I suggested to the president, as the Bitcoin advisor to the president, that he should include a line in CPAC that said, "Who's the banana republic now, bitch?" But he opted not to use that phraseology, sadly. I think it would have gone viral. But like everything I've suggested to the president so far in my 2 years here, he has pretty much rejected every one of my suggestions. But nevertheless, I keep trying.
So there really has been a big change in El Salvador, and it's because of this president. And he did put all the criminals in jail, and people didn't think he could do that, and he did it. And then he did adopt Bitcoin, and there does seem to be, from my perspective, and I'm no genius, but it does seem to be there is a kind of revolution of freedom happening in El Salvador, and all things are looking up. And Bitcoin is a big part of that, because it's exactly as you've been explaining, that it's decentralized. They can't stop you. They can't control you like they can control us here in the United States and Canada, and everywhere else, which they've already done. And then what the United States is doing, which is a huge mistake, they're doing it around the world, is they are weaponizing the dollar, right? So the world uses the American dollar as its reserve currency. And the worst thing you could do is to weaponize it, meaning sanction people. And so what they're doing to Russia, and when you talked about the SWIFT, the way they, so there's the, how would you describe what SWIFT is? SWIFT is like what is SWIFT?
It's a global dollar money rail. People use, when you send money from country to country, they ask for your SWIFT number of the bank that is receiving this money. So it's the U.S. has a monopoly on this, and the U.S. is world reserve currency since World War II.
It's like the Venmo. It's like the Venmo of the world, right? And to make someone like me understand it.
Yeah, pretty much.
And so what the United States has done recently is try to kick Russia out of SWIFT. And so
they kicked Iran off of SWIFT, and they sanctioned Russia and seized Russian assets. And so what your point is, they've weaponized the dollar, which is a terrible thing to do, because these countries are then motivated to come up with something other than the dollar.
Which is what BRICS
exactly what they're doing. So the BRICS nations are getting aggressively off the dollar. Global usage of the dollar is plummeting. And, this means that the U.S. empire, which is based on the globe using the U.S. dollar, is disintegrating. Without that, the income that comes from being the global bank, you lose a huge amount of cash that comes into the coffers of Washington. And, it's a Ponzi scheme. And the Ponzi scheme only works if there's people constantly who believe in the Ponzi scheme and who support the Ponzi scheme. Once people realize, oh my God, this is a Ponzi scheme, and they leave, the whole thing collapses rapidly, like at the end of any empire. And that's not the stage we're at now. The U.S. empire, the U.S. dollar empire, is the last inning of a massive Ponzi scheme that's been going on for 50, 60 years. And when it collapses, it'll happen like building number 7. It'll just be free falling in its own space. And everyone will wonder, how did that happen? It was so sudden. They'll make up some excuses, but it'll be quick and devastating.
And so why wouldn't the United States and NATO just say that the people in El Salvador need some democracy and then overthrow their government, which is what we always do? Why wouldn't we overthrow this new president and then install a puppet, get rid of crypto, and then everything's back to normal?
Well, 2 answers. Number one, El Salvador is solving a big problem for America on the southern border. Their southern border is out of control. And they look at El Salvador and they notice that less and less Salvadorans are making the trip north. So they're actually loving President Bukele, because he's helping them with a big problem that they have at the southern border, and they are now rooting for other countries to do the same, to follow in the Bukele model, and this would stem the number of migrants who are crossing the southern border. Number two, to your point, it is a struggle. We are dealing with the IMF. So the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is, John Perkins wrote about this in his Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which he worked for the bankers and the IMF. And when a Southern American country or Central American country did something that the bankers on Wall Street didn't like, they would send in the economic hitman, and they would, in fact, throw him out of an airplane, the leader of that country, et cetera. And the history is replete with examples of this. It's not debated. This is exactly what they do and have been done. Today, we've got the IMF fulfilling that role. It's trying to get as many countries in the world to get on the U.S. dollar. Donald Trump said last week that he's going to go after countries that stop using the dollar. And so they're very nervous. They're very nervous about the fact that the dollar is losing world reserve currency. There's nothing they can do about it. But, with the IMF, President Bukele has pretty much gone toe to toe, let's say, with the IMF. And he's in the process now of exiting the IMF. So the economy is growing sufficiently without the IMF's help. Thank you very much. The balance sheet of the country, by the way, the balance sheet of El Salvador, the country has hundreds of millions of dollars, close to $1 billion in Bitcoin. They're putting Bitcoin on their reserves, which helps them grow outside of all this fiat money madness. So not only do they use it as day-to-day legal tender, but the country itself has put Bitcoin on their balance sheet. We have an adopting El Salvador passport program. People are sending us $1 million in donation to get a El Salvadoran passport within 2 weeks. And then that money goes into Bitcoin. We've got some other financial kind of architecting that's going on, which is favoring Bitcoin. So that not only is the country have Bitcoin as legal tender, but it'll become a fully reserved Bitcoin country, which means that it'll be potentially the richest country in the world, because all these other countries are going to die into fiat money madness. They're all throwing this. Let me tell you, El Salvador is the next Singapore. The GDP here is going to triple in the next 5, 6, 7 years. This is the place to be, Jimmy. The U.S. is a fucking shithole. I mean, if you want to waste your time in that godforsaken hellhole, have at it. But if you want to be part of the revolution where people are optimistic and building the future, and there's economic freedom and freedom of speech, there's only one country in the world, and that's El Salvador. Get on a plane, come on down here. We'll set you up with a podcast. We got a beautiful studio. Taste freedom. I will baptize you in the Pacific Ocean and turn you into a Bitcoin maximalism. I have that role here. I'm the high priest of Bitcoin in El Salvador, and I will baptize you in the waters of the Pacific and Bitcoin Beach, and you and Steph, a future of optimism, and leave that godforsaken, fentanyl rattled, idle shithole behind, Jimmy.
So what is Bitcoin trading at right now today?
Last I checked, it was in the mid 60,000, 60,000, 63,000, whatever.
Okay. So let me just get this. So this is the president. How do you say his name? Bukele. So extraordinary El Salvador.
Or if you're Alex Jones, you can pronounce it Bukele.
Okay. It's like Barack Obama.
Yeah. You keep saying it. I'm like, Alex, his name is President Bukele.
So President Bukele
has issued a.
So his whole thing is he's against corruption. He cleaned up the criminals, and he gave a speech. Turn it down. So he says he brings everybody in there, everybody from his executive branches in this room, and everybody that he oversees, except for one person, the Attorney General. He has the Attorney General there who he does not oversee. He's not part of the executive branch. And the reason he's there, one simple reason, this is what he's saying, is that he wants to ask him publicly to investigate everyone sitting in that room. So everyone part of his administration, everybody in the executive branch, he said he wants them to invest retroactively and in the future. And he says there should be no problem with that. Someone once asked me, are you afraid of death? I said, of course, nobody wants to die. I don't want to die. But I know that I'll die someday like anyone else. 100 years from now, everybody in this room will be dead. None of us are going to still be alive. This is the president of El Salvador talking. And he said it's very likely that nobody here knows their grandfather's father's name. I don't. But if there is one thing I do fear, he says he fears leaving a bad legacy. There are some presidents, some in prison and some on the run. But the most are remembered as criminals, most of the presidents. That's not how I want to be remembered. And he says, so I don't steal because I don't want to be remembered as a criminal or as corrupt. But for one president, President Duarte, people back then used to say that he wasn't a thief, but the people who surrounded him were thieves. There was a time when he offered hope for the Salvadorian people. But even if it's true that he didn't steal, then he was foolish because he was the people's hope and he didn't touch a cent of the money, and he still stained his legacy by surrounding himself with thieves. That won't happen to me. I won't be the president that didn't steal but was surrounded by criminals. I want to be remembered as the president who didn't steal and didn't let anybody else steal either. And the one who put whoever stole in prison. There's a couple who are already there. So that's a big deal for him to say. So he is asking the Attorney General of El Salvador, investigate everybody in my administration, everybody in the executive branch, what they did in the past, what they're doing currently, doing in the future, investigate. So what makes him, what's the significance of that and what makes him say that?
He hates corruption. And he's told the Attorney General to investigate every minister in the country for any corruption or wrongdoing. And if he finds any, put him in jail. Because it's a drag on the economy and it's not good for the country. And the people that gave him an 87% vote in the last election, just a few months ago, this is what they demand. President Bukele serves the people. The people want no more corruption. So he's going to get rid of anybody who is corrupt.
I mean,
he got rid of the gangsters.
It looks crazy hearing someone say those things. It's a leader of a country.
Well, I mean, all he does is all day long. I mean, I've had the pleasure of spending some time with him and talking to him a little bit. And, he is a guy who all he does 24 hours a day is think about how to improve the country. And he looks at every single detail. I was at a dinner not too long ago, and he was talking about the restrooms at the airport needed to be cleaner. And I'm like, what? 10 minutes before that, he was talking about a $1 billion bond offering. And then he segues right into the details of what people experience at the airport. And this is the mind of like a Steve Jobs meets JFK, right? He's a JFK. He's about energizing people to do something for their country. And at the same time, he's like Steve Jobs, where he can keep 10,000 details in his head and just execute as an executive so many brilliant things, like just changing the tourist visa from 90 days to 180 days. So now suddenly all that tourist money is here for twice as long. That's an easy fix. He did it in a day. He had the idea, he changed it. The next day it was changed. So he's just like rapid fire going through this enormous list of tasks to do, and he's getting things done. Infrastructure, roads, everything is done. He's getting it all done. And so corruption.
So how is he not, and not, I don't mean to be morbid or dark, but usually when someone comes along like that, they kill him, just like they did JFK and RFK. And so how is he avoiding being assassinated? It's a serious question.
Well, he has a security detail, and like any president, and they're doing a good job. Let's hope that the president continues in doing his job. I think that if you look at the folks, the enemy, the U.S., the CIA, the FBI, like the CIA can't even do a coup anymore. Like I think they tried a coup in Venezuela now twice in the last 10 years.
Yes,
and they failed. Like they're completely inept. Like the CIA from the 60s and 70s that we remember, they're gone. It's now a bunch of fumbling jackasses who are smoke pot and watch porn all day. Like they're just like fat slobs. They don't know shit. So they don't even know how to do a coup anymore. They just get free money from the Fed and they just go down to the porno shop and they smoke a bong. They're like completely worthless. So and they're in a fiat money standard. And within the U.S. government, I call it the fifth column. You now have senators and congresspeople in the U.S. government that are Bitcoiners. So that's our fifth column. There's a soft coup in America right now by Bitcoiners who are in the U.S. government right now, like Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming. She's a Bitcoin maximalist. She's part of the fifth column. She's a Bitcoiner. And now every single day you hear, I think Rand Paul is a Bitcoiner. Ted Cruz is a Bitcoiner. It tends to be more on the conservative side for sure, but it's foolishly because Bitcoin to me is a leftist paradise. Everything the left complains about, you can solve it with Bitcoin. But but nevertheless, so this is all being mobilized within the government. So the U.S. government is collapsing. The fiat money world is collapsing. I don't think they'll have the wherewithal to do these types of things anymore. They're a spent force. They just don't have it anymore. And it's just we can't think of them like we do like from the 70s, really. It's a clown show. It's a clown car. They don't know how to fucking whip their way out of a paper bag. They suck.
Hey, come see us do a live show. We're going to be in Denver, Colorado, May 11th, Los Angeles, California, doing a live panel show with a celebrity panel and video, Ashland, Virginia, Athens, Georgia, Rutherford, New Jersey, with Max Blumenthal, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Ontario, California, Irvine, California, Chicago, Illinois, with another celebrity panel, live video show in Chicago, and Grand Rapids, Michigan. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets. jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.